The Mafia boss and the Clumsy caregiver. The order cut through the mansion before Hannah Mitchell had even finished apologizing. Get her out of my house. The glass of water she'd accidentally tipped across Adrian Romano's tailored shirt was still dripping onto the marble floor, one thin rivulet tracing the seam of his sleeve. Every guard in the room reacted at once, shoulders squaring, hands twitching toward the doors, as though the spilled water had been an act of aggression rather than an accident. In the world these men lived in, a mistake near Adrian Romano was never just a mistake. But Hannah didn't move. She stayed exactly where she stood, both hands wrapped around the empty tray, her knuckles pale. "If you're firing me because I spilled water on you," she said, forcing herself to hold the ice-cold stare of the man in the wheelchair, then at least finish yelling first. Nobody breathed. No one, in the 6 months since the accident, had ever spoken to Adrian Romano that way. Billionaire, ruthless negotiator. And behind the polished walls of Romano Global Holdings, the quiet ruler of one of the most feared criminal organizations in the world. He was a man who ended careers with a glance, and unmade men with a phone call. Now he sat paralyzed in a wheelchair, a spinal injury having taken from him the one thing he had never learned to live without control. 6 professional caregivers had already come and gone. Flawless resumes, polished manners. Not one of them had lasted a full week. Hannah had managed to spill water on him within 5 minutes. By every reasonable standard, her employment should have ended before the ink on her contract dried. Instead, Adrian laughed. It was brief, a single startled sound, gone almost before anyone could be sure they'd heard it, but it landed in the frozen silence of the estate like a stone dropped into still water. A guard by the door glanced at his colleague, unsure he could trust his own ears. The housekeeper, hovering in the hallway, pressed a hand to her mouth. The coldest man in the city had laughed at the woman who'd just made the biggest blunder of her career. The laughter faded quickly, replaced by the narrow, familiar expression that everyone in the household had learned to fear. He dragged a damp sleeve across his shirt and studied her. "You're unusually calm," he observed. "I've already imagined getting fired at least 12 times since breakfast," Hannah admitted. "Reality can't be much worse than the versions in my head." A few of the security detail found something very interesting to look at on the floor, hiding smiles they didn't dare show. Adrian noticed. He always noticed. "So," he said slowly, "you embarrass yourself often." "Professionally?" she exhaled. "Personally, too, if I'm being completely honest." Another small laugh escaped him before he could catch it. He couldn't have explained why her honesty felt refreshing. Every specialist before her had walked into his home treating him like an impossible assignment, measuring every word, calculating every movement, terrified of one wrong step. Hannah had already made 6 wrong steps, and somehow she seemed far less concerned with protecting her reputation than with making sure he was comfortable. Dr. Liam Foster arrived a moment later, already braced to draft another resignation letter. Instead, Adrian said simply, "She stays." The physician blinked. "Are you certain?" I didn't stutter. Liam hid his surprise behind a professional nod, though something like relief settled quietly in his chest. For months he had searched for anyone who could reach the man buried beneath Adrian's carefully built walls. Perhaps, he thought, technical perfection had never been what Adrian actually needed. Hannah spent the rest of that first morning learning the mansion's rhythms, medication schedules, rehabilitation equipment, nutritional requirements, emergency protocols. She memorized all of it with surprising speed. Then she walked directly into a half-open door. The dull thud echoed down the corridor. 2 housekeepers gasped. Hannah rubbed her forehead, winced, and then laughed at herself. Well, she announced to no one in particular, at least the door was here first. From the far end of the hallway, watching, Adrian felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward before he could stop it. The pattern held over the following days. She dropped a stack of therapy bands. She nearly sat on a remote control. She confused his black coffee with her own decaffeinated cup, catching the mistake at the last possible second. And every mishap was followed by the same response, not panic, not a flurry of excuses, but a sheepish smile and a quiet determination to keep going. What surprised Adrian most wasn't the clumsiness. It was what came after. She never treated him like a helpless patient. She spoke to him as though recovery were merely a difficult destination rather than an impossible dream. When he refused an exercise, She didn't lecture, she asked about his favorite cities. When he ignored a meal, she stayed in the room, unbothered, until curiosity finally pulled him into conversation. When pain darkened his mood, she acknowledged it plainly, without a drop of pity. Slowly, the mansion began to notice something extraordinary. The doors no longer felt heavy. The staff started speaking at a normal volume again. Even the security team caught themselves smiling whenever they overheard Hannah's hopeless attempts to keep a straight face after yet another harmless disaster. The great Romano estate, frozen for 6 months in silence, had begun to hear laughter again. Daily rehabilitation began the following Monday. At precisely 8 o'clock each morning, Hannah wheeled Adrian into the private therapy room overlooking the gardens. The space held every piece of equipment money could buy, and nearly all of it had gathered dust. For 6 months, Adrian had refused almost every exercise his doctors proposed, convinced that hope was more painful than failure ever could be. The moment she positioned his chair beside the parallel bars, he crossed his arms. "I'm not doing it." She glanced at her clipboard. "Wonderful." His eyebrows rose. "Wonderful." "I was worried today's plan looked too easy." He stared at her. "You think refusing therapy is easy?" "I think arguing with me burns fewer calories than the exercises would." One of the physical therapists coughed to smother a laugh and earned a look from Adrian that instantly restored his posture. Hannah remained entirely unfazed. She stepped up to the therapy bars, stretched dramatically, and declared, "Fine, since you won't participate, I'll compete against myself." Before anyone could ask what that meant, she attempted a simple balance exercise. 3 seconds later, her own shoelace caught beneath her foot. She stumbled sideways, spun in an awkward half-circle, and saved herself only by throwing both arms around a padded bar. Silence. Then Hannah raised one finger with great dignity. "I meant to test the safety equipment." Even Adrian shook his head. "You're unbelievable." "Thank you." That wasn't a compliment. "I'll take it anyway." For the first time since the accident, therapy didn't feel like a reminder of everything he'd lost. It felt ridiculous, and strangely, it felt entertaining. Over the following days, Hannah quietly abandoned every motivational speech in her repertoire. Instead, she turned each session into a game. If Adrian completed 5 arm repetitions, she'd attempt to pronounce the names of elaborate Italian dishes without embarrassing herself. If he finished 10 shoulder exercises, he earned 1 personal question. If he made it through an entire stretching routine without complaining, she promised not to tell him the terrible joke she'd prepared. Naturally, he complained constantly. "You changed the rules. You counted too fast. That repetition shouldn't qualify. My shoulder hurts." "My patience hurts," Hannah replied cheerfully. "And yet here we both are." Their arguments became a daily performance. Staff passing the therapy room often slowed at the sound of raised voices, braced for a confrontation, only to overhear exchanges that made no sense at all. "I refuse." "Too late. I already wrote your name on today's participation chart." "I don't care." "You will when I tell you I decorated it with gold stars." "I'm 43, acting 14. Even Dr. Foster noticed the change. The numbers remained modest, but Adrian had stopped skipping appointments. More importantly, he no longer spent every session staring at the floor, he argued. He questioned. He rolled his eyes and occasionally rarely smirked. Those tiny reactions revealed something no scan ever could. His mind was coming back to life. One rainy afternoon, Hannah introduced what she proudly called the world's least impressive championship. The objective: Adrian would transfer himself from his wheelchair to the therapy bench, unaided. Success earned 1 point. Failure earned an embarrassing victory dance from Hannah to celebrate the effort. "This competition makes absolutely no sense," Adrian said. "Exactly," he sighed. "You'll dance either way, won't you?" "Almost certainly." After several determined attempts, his arms trembling beneath the strain, he lost his balance halfway through the transfer. Before the therapist could react, Hannah steadied him not forcefully, not with pity, just enough support to let him finish the movement on his own. He landed on the bench, breathing hard. "You cheated. I assisted. You touched my elbow. I saved your dignity. I didn't ask you to." "No," she said softly. "You didn't have to." The answer lingered in the room longer than it should have. She never made him feel weak for accepting help. She treated assistance as something temporary, never permanent. As they packed up, Adrian noticed her clipboard lying open on the table. Most of the page held exercise notes, but near the bottom, boxed in her uneven handwriting, was a single sentence. Today's goal isn't walking. Today's goal is believing tomorrow might be different. He read it twice, then quietly closed the clipboard. He didn't mention it, neither did she. The next morning, Adrian arrived in the therapy room 5 minutes early. When Hannah walked in carrying breakfast and her notes, she stopped short. "I thought you hated mornings." "I still do." "Then why are you here?" He looked away. "I wanted to win today's argument before you arrived." She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the tray, and though Adrian immediately pretended to regret speaking, the faint smile that followed gave him away. Without quite realizing it, he had begun trying harder. Not because he'd suddenly started believing in his recovery, but because every session with Hannah made surrender a little more difficult. The first real breakthrough was so small, most people would have missed it. Dr. Liam Foster did not. 3 weeks into Hannah's assignment, Adrian completed an entire morning session without once asking to stop. His shoulders held steadier through the transfers. His grip strength had improved. And, for the first time since the injury, faint muscle activity flickered in his lower back during electrical stimulation. The numbers were modest. The significance was enormous. Liam reviewed the scans twice before walking into Adrian's office. "Your body is responding." Adrian barely glanced up from the financial report spread across his desk. "It isn't enough." It wasn't responding at all a month ago. Silence settled between them. Finally, Adrian said, quietly, "Don't mistake improvement for recovery." Liam understood the fear underneath the words. Hope had become dangerous. The higher a man let himself climb, the farther he could fall. That afternoon, Hannah found Adrian unusually quiet during therapy. "No sarcastic comments today?" she asked, adjusting the resistance bands. "I'm conserving energy for rehabilitation and for surviving your motivational speeches." She gasped in mock outrage. "I have speeches? You somehow turn breakfast into life philosophy." She pretended to consider it. "I suppose pancakes are deeply symbolic." "They're pancakes. They represent resilience. They represent syrup." She laughed so hard she dropped the resistance band. It snapped upward and bounced lightly off her own forehead. She froze. Adrian stared. A heartbeat later, they both dissolved into laughter. A therapist nearby smiled to himself. Months earlier, that room had echoed only with silence and frustration. Now it sounded alive. The improvements continued through the weeks. Adrian could stay upright longer without exhaustion. Transfers required less help. His upper body regained real strength. Most importantly, he stopped treating each exercise as a punishment and began approaching therapy the way he approached everything else, as a strategic problem to be solved. He started asking questions. What muscle is this targeting? Why are we changing the routine today? How long before we increase resistance? Hannah answered each one patiently, never celebrating too early, never letting disappointment linger on the hard days. "Recovery isn't a straight road," she reminded him. "It's more like me walking down a hallway, dangerous, unpredictable, almost guaranteed to collide with something." One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Adrian stayed in the therapy room while she put the equipment away. Without looking at her, he asked, "Why rehabilitation?" She paused. "No one's ever asked me that. I'm asking now." She folded a therapy towel carefully before answering. "My father spent 2 years learning to walk again after a construction accident." Adrian turned toward her. "I was 16. Everyone focused on whether he'd ever walk." She smiled softly. "I focused on whether he'd ever laugh again, and he did, long before he took his first step." She slid another band into its drawer. "That's when I understood something. A broken body isn't always the hardest part. A broken sense of hope is." The room went quiet. Adrian recognized the truth of it at once, because he had spent 6 months guarding himself against exactly that. He had accepted paralysis more easily than he had ever accepted vulnerability. That night, unable to sleep, he replayed the conversation and realized, with some discomfort, how little he actually knew about her. He knew she preferred tea over coffee because she spilled less of it. He knew she hummed while organizing equipment. He knew she apologized to furniture after bumping into it, and that every member of the household smiled more when she walked into a room. But of the woman herself, He knew almost nothing. The next morning, he noticed something new. She arrived with the same warm smile as always, but beneath it sat an exhaustion she couldn't quite hide. Dark shadows ringed her eyes. She tugged her sleeves down as she greeted him. "Good morning. You barely slept." "I'm fine." He studied her. "You lied." She laughed lightly. "I didn't realize billionaires specialized in diagnosing fatigue. We specialize in observing people." She busied herself with the equipment. "It's nothing." But he'd already caught the way she hesitated whenever she passed her own reflection in the glass doors. Later, while she spoke with Dr. Foster just outside the room, Adrian overheard part of their conversation without meaning to. "You shouldn't let strangers get to you," Liam was saying gently. "I'm trying not to. They're wrong." "I know." A pause. Then Hannah sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone ever sees anything past my weight, or the fact that I'm always tripping over my own feet. People see far more than that." "I hope so." Her voice sounded less certain than usual. "Some days I just forget." Inside the therapy room, Adrian sat perfectly still. For weeks, she had filled his days with jokes and optimism and endless patience, and he had assumed confidence came to her as naturally as breathing. Now he understood. Her humor wasn't proof that life had been kind to her. It was how she carried her burdens without setting them on anyone else's shoulders. When Hannah came back, she found him already waiting beside the parallel bars unasked, without complaint. She blinked. "I thought the session started in 10 minutes. "It does." "Then why are you already here?" He reached for the bars, determination replacing his usual hesitation. "I don't like wasting your time." The words were simple, but to Hannah they meant more than any successful exercise, because for the first time since they'd met, Adrian Romano wasn't fighting his recovery merely because someone expected it of him. He was fighting because someone believed he still had a future. And, little by little, he was beginning to believe it too. By early autumn, Adrian's progress was impossible to ignore. He still relied on the wheelchair for most of the day, but he could now stand for brief moments with support. His therapists began speaking cautiously about the possibility of walking again. Dr. Foster refused to name timelines, yet each evaluation ended a little more hopeful than the last. That season, the Romano Foundation chose to hold its annual charity gala with more fanfare than ever. Hospital directors, business leaders, celebrities, and international donors gathered beneath one glittering ballroom ceiling. Officially, the evening honored advances in rehabilitation medicine. Unofficially, it marked Adrian Romano's first major public appearance since the accident. Hannah had no desire to go. She preferred therapy rooms to ballrooms and flat shoes to designer heels, but Adrian insisted that every member of his rehabilitation team be recognized. "You belong there," he told her. "I'm the one who carries the resistance bands." "Exactly." She laughed nervously. "I'll probably trip over the red carpet." "You probably will. And you're still inviting me?" "I've accepted that accidents follow you." She rolled her eyes. "I'm choosing to believe that was almost a compliment." "It was," he said, "for once." Neither of them joked after that. The evening arrived with flashing cameras and applause. Adrian entered surrounded by executives and security, his wheelchair moving with unmistakable authority through the rows of distinguished guests. Even seated, his posture carried the weight of a man who had built both an empire in the light and one in the shadows. When Hannah arrived several minutes later, the room shifted. She wore a simple navy evening dress that complemented her figure without trying to hide it. She had spent nearly an hour talking herself into coming, and only because she believed Adrian deserved to see familiar faces in the crowd. Even so, standing among tailored tuxedos and glittering gowns, she felt entirely out of place. Isabella Vance noticed. Elegant as ever, the Foundation's director greeted donors with flawless grace before crossing the ballroom, deliberately toward Hannah. "My goodness," Isabella said, loud enough to carry. "You actually came." Hannah smiled politely. Mr. Romano invited the rehabilitation staff. How inclusive. Several nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Isabella pressed on. "I assumed someone would have explained the dress code." Hannah glanced down at her gown. "I thought this was appropriate for a hospital fundraiser." Isabella tilted her head, her smile practiced and cold. "Perhaps, For someone representing Adrian Romano, her expression hardened, not quite. The conversations around them quieted. People sensed something unpleasant coming. "You're undoubtedly kind," Isabella continued, "but appearances matter." She gestured lightly toward the crowd. "Mr. Romano is one of the most influential men in the world. He deserves elegance, poise, refinement." Her gaze traveled slowly over Hannah before returning to her face. Not someone remembered for knocking over coffee cups and stumbling into the furniture. A few uncomfortable laughs drifted over from guests eager to stay out of it. Each one landed like a bruise. Heat crept into Hannah's cheeks. For a moment, she considered defending herself. Instead, she thought of every patient who had ever trusted her with their most vulnerable days. She straightened her shoulders. "I'm sorry if my presence embarrasses you." Isabella smiled. "I'm relieved you understand." Hannah simply nodded. "I hope the evening raises a great deal of money for the foundation." And without another word, she turned and walked toward the nearest exit. No dramatic confrontation, no tears, no angry speech, just quiet dignity. From across the ballroom, Adrian had watched every second of it. He'd been speaking with investors when he saw Hannah standing alone, then saw Isabella approach. He couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He recognized the brave, tight smile Hannah wore whenever a stranger judged her before bothering to know her. By the time she reached the entrance hall, he'd already ended his conversation and was wheeling himself toward the doors as fast as he could manage, security hurrying behind him. Outside, beneath the evening lights, Hannah stood taking slow breaths. She heard the wheelchair before she saw him. "You left," she said, turning. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "You didn't." His voice was calm. "Someone else did." She attempted a smile. "It's only words." No, his eyes never left hers. It was cruelty dressed up as sophistication. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Hannah laughed softly. Sadness threaded through the sound. "I suppose Isabella isn't entirely wrong. I am clumsy. I don't exactly belong at glamorous galas." "Do you know what everyone inside that ballroom has been discussing tonight?" Adrian asked without hesitation. She shook her head. "They've been congratulating me for fighting to recover." He looked directly at her. "Not one of them knows the person who convinced me recovery was worth fighting for." Hannah's eyes glistened. Before she could answer, the ballroom doors opened again. Several board members spilled out, searching anxiously for Adrian, and found something none of them expected. The feared Mafia boss wasn't furious over a failed deal. He wasn't negotiating a contract or defending his reputation. He was furious because someone had humiliated the woman who had quietly rebuilt his hope. And for the first time since the accident, his anger had become deeply, unmistakably personal. By the next morning, rumors were circulating through Romano Global Holdings. By noon, they had hardened into certainty. Every executive, board member, and foundation director received an urgent summons to a special meeting. No explanation accompanied it. Those who knew Adrian well understood exactly what that silence meant. Something had happened. Inside the executive conference room, quiet settled long before he arrived. Isabella Vance entered with perfect composure, convinced the previous evening had simply removed an embarrassing distraction from Adrian's life. In her mind, she had protected the Romano name. When the doors opened, everyone stood. Adrian rolled to the head of the table, accompanied only by Dr. Foster. No greetings, no preamble. He set a single folder on the polished surface. "I've reviewed last night's security recordings." A few executives shifted. Isabella remained serene. "I'm pleased the Foundation's event received such careful attention." "It did." His voice carried no emotion. "So did your behavior." The room went perfectly still. He pressed a button. Without editing or commentary, the surveillance footage replayed Isabella's conversation with Hannah exactly as it had happened. Every insult, every carefully disguised humiliation, every smile designed to wound. No one interrupted. When it ended, the silence weighed even heavier than before. Adrian looked slowly around the table. "Our foundation exists for one purpose, to restore dignity to people facing life's hardest challenges." His eyes settled on Isabella. "You used its stage to strip it from someone." She opened her mouth. "I was protecting your reputation." "My reputation," he leaned forward slightly. "The woman you mocked has spent months protecting something far more valuable. My will to live." The words struck harder than anyone expected. Several board members lowered their eyes. Even those who knew nothing of Adrian's private struggle understood they were witnessing something intensely personal. Isabella attempted one last defense. With respect, Adrian, appearances matter. They always have. You deserve someone polished, sophisticated, someone worthy of standing beside a man of your position. Adrian answered without raising his voice. I've spent my entire life surrounded by polished people. He paused. Very few of them possessed any genuine kindness. His gaze held hers. Hannah Mitchell walks into walls. She spills coffee. She apologizes to furniture. Soft laughter rippled through the room and faded just as quickly. But every room she enters becomes kinder. Every patient believes tomorrow is possible because she refuses to stop believing first. He closed the folder. As of this moment, you are removed as director of the Romano Foundation. Shock swept the table, effective immediately. Isabella's composure finally cracked. You can't dismiss years of my work over one caregiver. No, Adrian said evenly. I'm dismissing you because you forgot the purpose of the foundation you were trusted to lead. Security stepped forward. Without further argument, Isabella gathered her things and left. No one spoke until the doors had closed behind her. Then Adrian turned to the remaining board members. If anyone here believes compassion weakens leadership, you're free to resign today. Nobody moved. The meeting ended minutes later, but Adrian found himself thinking of only one person. He expected to find Hannah preparing the afternoon therapy session. Instead, Dr. Foster met him outside the rehabilitation room, holding a sealed envelope. She asked me to give you this. Adrian frowned. What is it? I think you should read it yourself. He opened it. The first line tightened something in his chest. Letter of resignation. He read every word in silence. Hannah thanked him for trusting her. She thanked him for the chance to witness his recovery. She apologized, in case her presence had ever complicated his public image. She insisted his progress no longer depended on her, that another caregiver could guide him the rest of the way. At the bottom, one final line. You deserve a future without someone constantly making accidental messes around you. Adrian stared at the page for a long moment. Then he folded it once, twice, and slid it back into the envelope. He found her in a storage room, packing therapy manuals into a box. She looked up with an uncertain smile. I hoped Liam would explain. He did. Adrian held up the envelope. I won't sign it. She blinked. You haven't even read the reasons. I read all of them. His jaw set. They're wrong. She lowered her eyes. After last night, everyone saw exactly what Isabella meant. I don't belong in your world. You belong exactly where you've been since the day you arrived. I'm becoming a distraction. No, he said. You became the reason I stopped giving up. The words hung in the air. Hannah felt tears threaten and quickly looked away. You don't owe me your future. I know, Adrian answered. I'm choosing it. For the first time since the accident, the fearless Mafia boss struggled to voice something no business negotiation had ever demanded of him: gratitude, trust, need. He took a slow breath. When 6 experts failed, you stayed. When I refused therapy, you came back the next morning. When I believed my life was over, you never argued with me. You just acted as though tomorrow still existed. He held out the resignation letter. Then, deliberately, he tore it cleanly in half, and again, the pieces drifted into the nearby wastebasket. There, he said, his voice softening. Problem solved. A laugh escaped her through the tears. You know that's not how paperwork works. No, he finally smiled, but it's how hope works. Neither of them looked away. Neither quite realized they had already crossed the invisible line between patient and caregiver, not through grand declarations or impossible promises, but through countless ordinary days in which 2 wounded people had quietly begun saving each other. Winter arrived quietly, and with it, a rhythm no one inside Romano Estate would have believed possible a few months earlier. Rehabilitation was no longer something Adrian endured. It had become part of his life. Every morning began the same way: Hannah, arriving with breakfast in one hand and a clipboard in the other, and nearly dropping one of them. One memorable morning she saved the tray, lost her balance, spun in a full awkward circle, and somehow ended up sitting on the therapy mat with a look of profound bewilderment. Adrian watched the entire performance. I've been analyzing that technique. Oh? I've concluded gravity likes you a little too much. She laughed. I prefer to think gravity is emotionally attached. As his strength returned, the therapy grew harder. Standing exercises lasted longer. Weight-bearing drills became more punishing. His legs, once almost entirely unresponsive, slowly began to remember movements they had forgotten. The progress was painfully slow. Some mornings brought improvement, others brought frustration. On the hardest days, his old temper resurfaced. One afternoon, his knees buckled halfway through a standing exercise. Before Hannah could steady him, he dropped back into the wheelchair, furious. This is pointless. It isn't. I've been doing this for months. Yes. And I'm still counting seconds instead of steps. She knelt until they were at eye level. Do you remember your first therapy session? I remember refusing to participate. You also couldn't transfer to the bench without nearly exhausting yourself. He said nothing. Today you stood for almost 90 seconds. 90 seconds isn't walking. No. She smiled gently, but 90 seconds used to be impossible. He looked away. I hate needing help. I know. I hate feeling weak. I know. I hate disappointing everyone. This time she answered at once. You're not. She reached into her bag and pulled out something unexpected, a small, worn notebook. I've never shown you this. He took it, curious. Each page held handwritten notes, not medical charts, not treatment schedules, victories. Day 3, Adrian agreed to finish breakfast. Day 8, first genuine laugh. Day 15, completed every exercise without leaving the room. Day 24, asked his first rehabilitation question. Day 41, smiled at the housekeeper. Day 56, encouraged another patient during his hospital evaluation. The entries ran on for months. Some described physical milestones. Many did not. He turned another page. Day 97, stopped calling himself broken. His throat tightened. I don't remember saying that. You stopped saying it, she said. That mattered more. He closed the notebook carefully. You've been recording all of this. I promised myself I'd remember every victory, especially the ones you couldn't see. Outside, snow drifted past the tall windows. Inside, something heavier than silence settled between them. A few weeks later, Dr. Foster adjusted the plan one final time. The next phase won't be easy, he warned. It'll probably be the hardest yet. Adrian nodded. When do we start? Liam smiled. That's the first time you've ever asked me that. The final stage focused on independent standing and assisted walking. The parallel bars became Adrian's daily battlefield. Each attempt demanded enormous concentration, each step calling on muscles that had spent months relearning their purpose. Hannah stayed beside him every time, never pulling, never dragging, only close enough to catch him if she had to. One cold morning, after nearly 4 months of relentless work, Adrian wrapped both hands around the bars. His breathing slowed. The room fell silent. House staff gathered quietly in the doorway. Even the security team paused their rounds. Everyone sensed it. Ready? Hannah asked softly. No. She smiled. Good. Neither am I, he laughed. The small laugh eased the tension. Then he pushed upward. His arms trembled. His legs shook violently beneath him. Pain crossed his face. For one terrible second, it looked as though he would collapse. He didn't. He stood. Not for seconds. For nearly a full minute. No one spoke. Dr. Foster discreetly wiped the corner of his eye. Hannah's own hands shook. Though she never reached for him, she knew he wanted this to belong entirely to him. I think, Adrian whispered. My legs, remember? They do, Hannah said, her voice cracking. They've been trying to tell you that for months. Several days later came the moment no medical chart could have predicted. Supported only by a single cane, and Hannah walking beside him, Adrian prepared to leave the parallel bars for the first time. One step, then another, slow, unsteady, painful yet undeniably real. The whole team watched in absolute silence. Halfway across the room, he stopped. Everyone assumed he needed to rest. Instead, he turned away from the therapist waiting ahead, away from Dr. Foster, away from the applause already beginning behind him. He looked only at Hannah, who stood a few feet away with tears filling her eyes. Without a word, he changed direction. Each step took everything he had. His legs trembled. His breathing grew ragged. Still, he moved toward her. Only her. When he finally reached her, neither spoke at once. Hannah instinctively reached out, afraid he'd lose his balance. Instead, Adrian gently took both of her hands. "I thought," he said, struggling to steady his voice and his breath, "that my first step should lead to the person who never stopped believing I'd take them." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "You did this." He shook his head. "No, you taught me something far more important." "What?" she whispered. He smiled a smile no one in Romano Estate would ever forget. Walking wasn't the miracle. Wanting to live again was. The room erupted into applause. Neither of them noticed. For the first time since fate had brought them together, the wheelchair that had once symbolized despair stood empty behind them, and in front of them, a completely new future had just taken its first steps. 8 months on, very little inside Romano Estate looked the same. The hallways no longer echoed with whispers. Employees laughed openly at lunch. Fresh flowers appeared in windows that had stood bare for years. Even the security guards, once famous for their intimidating faces, had somehow acquired the habit of smiling whenever Hannah walked past. No one questioned it. She had changed the atmosphere of the place long before Adrian ever took his first step. He had returned to work. Officially, he was once again the commanding CEO of Romano Global Holdings, moving between boardrooms and international conferences with the same sharp strategic mind that had built his empire. Unofficially, he had also resumed quiet leadership of the powerful organization that depended on his judgment. The criminal world still feared his decisions. The business world still respected his intelligence. Neither knew that the hardest battle he had ever won had been fought in a rehabilitation room. He walked confidently now. Not perfectly long meetings left stiffness in his back, and hard days reminded him that recovery was an ongoing journey rather than a finished destination. But every step carried something impossible to measure: hope. One Monday morning, Adrian walked into the executive dining room carrying his own breakfast. The entire staff froze. Months earlier, every meal had been delivered to his office because he refused interruptions. Now he simply sat by the window. 5 minutes later, Hannah hurried in, therapy notebook in hand. She was no longer his full-time caregiver officially. She served as his rehabilitation consultant, visiting several mornings a week to oversee his long-term recovery plan. Unofficially, she still worried about him constantly. "You skipped your stretching routine yesterday," she said before she'd even sat down. Adrian looked genuinely surprised. "Good morning to you, too. You also worked until nearly midnight." "I had meetings." "You had excuses." One executive hid a smile behind his coffee. Another murmured, "Here we go." Hannah folded her arms. "Did you eat lunch?" "Eventually." "Define eventually." "There was food, Adrian." "There may have been coffee." She sighed dramatically. "You are impossible." And Adrian, with the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly how this would end, replied, "And yet, you're still here." She rolled her eyes. "I ask myself why every single day." Before she could go on, her sleeve caught a spoon and sent it clattering to the floor. The whole table turned toward her. Hannah closed her eyes. "It's the furniture. It plans these things." The room burst into warm laughter. Adrian bent down, picked up the spoon before anyone else could move, and handed it back to her. Months ago, she had been the one constantly helping him. Now the gesture flowed naturally the other way. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. That afternoon, several long-time employees watched the two of them walking through the gardens together. Their pace was slow. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just enjoyed the quiet. One younger accountant smiled. So who actually saved whom? The question carried farther than intended. Adrian heard it. He stopped and looked back toward the group. For a moment, everyone braced for another dry joke. Instead, he answered with complete sincerity. "I thought I hired someone to help me walk." His eyes found Hannah, and a gentle smile softened the strength that had once silenced entire boardrooms. "Instead, she taught me how to live again." Silence followed, not the heavy silence that had once filled the mansion, but a peaceful one. Hannah ducked her head, embarrassed. "You make it sound like I performed miracles." Adrian chuckled. "You did. I spilled water on you. You did. I walked into at least 4 doors. Closer to 7. I dropped your medical charts. You apologized to the charts." She laughed. "I still think they deserved it." "So do I." Their eyes met, and nothing dramatic needed saying. The slow, quiet love that had grown through patience and trust and laughter and healing had already spoken for them. It had never begun with grand declarations. It began with a woman brave enough to stay after the most embarrassing mistake of her career, and a man courageous enough to laugh when everyone else expected anger. People often search for miracles in extraordinary places. In truth, miracles sometimes arrive wearing comfortable shoes, carrying therapy notes, bumping into door frames. Sometimes they come disguised as patience, sometimes as kindness, sometimes as a person who simply refuses to let someone else surrender, because the greatest miracles are rarely about standing up after a devastating fall. They're about believing life is still worth living, long before the first step is ever taken. For Adrian Romano and Hannah Mitchell, recovery was never simply the story of a man learning to walk again. It was the story of two wounded hearts, discovering that healing becomes possible the moment someone chooses to stay.